Today we will be exploring 8 caving expeditions that went terribly wrong, from narrow squeezes and sudden floods to eerie discoveries deep underground. Each story reveals just how unpredictable and dangerous these adventures can be. So without any further ado, let's get started. And as always, viewer discretion is always advised.
On August 2, 2004, 15-year-old Abby Peterson joined her campmates from Camp Kumbaya for what seemed like a fun cave adventure at Island Ford Cave in Virginia. The air was heavy with humidity as Abby strapped on her helmet, adjusted her headlamp, and listened to the safety rules. She was excited. None of them knew how quickly that excitement would turn into fear. Island Ford Cave was popular with local spelunkers, and the camp had led teens into its easier sections for years without issue. Tom Watson, the lead counselor, knew the cave well, having explored it dozens of times. His calm leadership eased the group as 8 teenagers stepped into the dark opening. With each step inside, the summer heat faded, replaced with cool underground air. For the first hour, the trip went smoothly. The group squeezed through narrow passages, their hearts racing with the thrill of moving through untouched stone. Abby, who had been waiting for this adventure since camp began, carefully followed instructions, stepping cautiously on the uneven floor. About 500 feet, or 152 meters, from the entrance, the passage began to narrow again, leading into a breakdown area where their real challenge awaited. Here, the ceiling had collapsed long ago, leaving a maze of rocks and cracks that demanded careful steps. The space turned into a natural obstacle course of sharp edges and shaky ground. Abby walked fourth in line, following close behind Tom and 2 campers. Her headlamp lit the path just enough to reveal a few feet ahead. The breakdown forced them to cross rock by rock, some steady, others shifting dangerously. Tom guided them through, pointing out safe footing. When Abby's turn came, she stepped onto what looked secure. Without warning, the stone moved under her weight. Her world tilted as her arms flailed for balance. Then she fell. The drop was short, just 3 feet, but she landed hard between 2 large rocks. The impact sparked a second disaster. The unstable formation above her, disturbed by the fall, began to break apart. Stones from fist size to nearly 20 pounds tore loose from the walls. Abby had only a second to shield her head with her arms before the rocks crashed down around her. One rock struck her helmet with enough force to crack the plastic. When the brief rockfall ended, Abby was partly buried. Stones pressed across her torso and left arm, while her legs lay stretched out and stuck. The weight on her chest turned every breath into effort, each inhale squeezed tight. At first, the pain was mild, more shocking than sharp. Then came the awful truth. She wasn't just buried, her right leg was locked between 2 massive boulders. She twisted, trying to pull free, but her body was pinned from several angles. Her legs stretched painfully, wedged from mid-calf to ankle. The reality hit her hard, along with the crushing thought of the endless stone above. Her breaths quickened, panic swelling like water flooding her chest. The cave that had seemed magical moments earlier now felt like a stone prison tightening around her. Tom reacted fast, scrambling to her side. His first task was to clear the heavy rocks covering much of her body, with everyone rushing to help. They cleared the rocks burying her, then, one by one, Tom worked carefully over her torso, removing stones methodically from smallest to largest. Each piece lifted allowed Abby to breathe a little deeper, but relief was fleeting while her leg stayed trapped. His trained eyes quickly saw the real problem. Her leg was jammed deep in a narrow crevice, twisted at an angle that robbed her of leverage to pull free. The fallen debris had worsened things, pinning her in a position that made escape nearly impossible. The pain sharpened as shock faded, no longer just the stinging blows from falling rocks, but the grinding pressure of stone against flesh. Worse was the creeping numbness that began at her toes and crept upward, a chilling sign of circulation failing. Tom drew on all his training, trying everything he could. He tested the smaller of the 2 massive rocks trapping her, but it was part of a larger formation, unmovable without tools. He cleared loose stones around her leg to make space, yet the pressure points held. Even using his own body for leverage, every attempt only wedged her leg deeper, sealing her tighter in place.
Meanwhile, the other teenagers huddled nearby. Some whispered encouragement, while others stood frozen in silence. The cave's 55-degree Fahrenheit, 13 degrees Celsius, chill, once refreshing, now seeped into Abby's bones like a cruel enemy. Underground, time twisted strangely. What felt like 15 minutes dragged into endless hours as Tom tried again and again to free her. Abby's panic had dulled into resignation, broken only by sharp waves of pain each time she moved. The cave floor's moisture had soaked through her jeans, adding the misery of cold dampness to her ordeal. With no options left, Tom made a hard choice. He told Julie, the assistant counselor, to take the quickest path back to the surface and call for rescue. Waiting became its own torment. Every minute stretched unbearably, her mind spiraling with fears. Would they have to break her leg? Would she be stuck for days? Each thought grew darker as the silence pressed in. Above ground, Julie sprinted toward the nearest vehicle, fumbling with trembling hands as she reached for the emergency phone. The rescue dispatcher answered on the second ring as Julie urgently explained the location. Rural Virginia maintained a specialized cave rescue team for such emergencies. Within 20 minutes of her call, volunteers assembled gear and headed toward Island Ford Cave. These weren't ordinary responders, but trained cave rescuers with expertise underground. In the darkness, Abby drifted between wakefulness and exhaustion. Nearly an hour after her fall, the first sign of hope appeared. A distant shout, then the glow of headlamps bouncing closer. Julie led 4 rescuers directly to them, carrying specialized tools. The team leader quickly assessed the trapped leg and injuries caused by falling rock. From a compact kit, he produced wedges and spreaders designed for cave extractions. He worked steadily, inserting progressively larger wedges to widen the space around Abby's leg. After 20 minutes of careful effort, they created barely half an inch of clearance. A paramedic applied lubricant gel, and with 3 rescuers pulling at the right angle, Abby's leg slid free at last. The relief was instant, but sharp pain followed as blood surged back. Now freed, rescuers examined her injuries, bruises across her back and shoulders, with a deep wound on her left blade bleeding steadily. They secured Abby onto a specialized stretcher, immobilizing her body to prevent further harm. Moving her through the cave was slow. The stretcher passed hand to hand in the narrowest passages. At last, they emerged into fading daylight, where an ambulance stood ready. At the hospital, doctors feared compartment syndrome, a dangerous buildup of pressure inside muscle, and checked for internal injuries from the rock impact. X-rays revealed no fractures in her leg, but 2 hairline fractures in her ribs. Despite the ordeal, Abby recovered fully in the days that followed.
George Lennon wasn't just a businessman or a DJ, he was a caver. Ever since diving into a Mexican cenote in 2014, he had dedicated himself to mastering some of the UK's most dangerous cave systems. In the caving world, George had a reputation: precise, careful, dependable. He didn't take shortcuts, he prepared for everything. This was a man deeply experienced in underground exploration and cave survival. On November 6, 2021, George joined 2 close friends, Melissa Bell and Mark Berkey, for a familiar challenge, exploring Ogof, the Black Cave in southern Wales. This would become one of the most intense UK cave rescue operations ever recorded. It's the deepest cave system in the UK, over 31 miles long and dropping more than 900 feet underground. It's not just big, it's a labyrinth, a place where even the smallest mistake can become deadly. Many call it one of the most dangerous caves in the world. The cave is divided into 3 sections, OFD 1, 2, and 3. Each one comes with its own dangers. From the very entrance near Penwilt, the route descends sharply, requiring immediate focus and skill. The OFD cave system is notorious among extreme caving enthusiasts. One of the riskiest areas, the Upper Smithy, is known for its unstable rock and sudden drops. It's a tight, crumbling zone that's injured more than a few seasoned explorers. Beyond that, the main streamway cuts through the cave with rushing water that can block entire paths after rain. Fast currents, slick footing, one misstep, and you are swept away. This is why cave rescue teams train specifically for environments like this. The cave doesn't stop there. It narrows without warning, forcing cavers to crawl through tight, suffocating gaps. And then there are the vertical shafts, steep, sheer climbs that require ropes, harnesses, and absolute control. The OFD cave system changes constantly. A cave like this isn't just mapped, it's survived. You rely on memory, markings, and instinct. One wrong turn, one missed foothold, and it's over. It's the kind of cave where real-life cave rescue stories begin. But George wasn't careless. He had studied this cave, trained for it, and on that November day, he thought he was ready. He wasn't alone, but in a place like Black Cave, even the most experienced team can be pushed past its limits. The plan was simple: a 6-hour cave trip with plenty of time to return for the evening fireworks at the South Wales Caving Club. Before entering Ogof Fun and Do, George, Melissa, and Mark ran a final check. Helmets on, LED headlamps tested, backups included. Harnesses secured, ropes inspected, reinforced suits, gloves, and knee pads in place. Each carried dry bags packed with essentials, maps, compasses, and working communication gear. Their gear setup mirrored those used in cave rescue training drills. Rain had fallen through the morning, soaking the hills and turning the cave's entrance into a slick slope. Still, the group pressed forward. The first hour went smoothly. Controlled steps, steady progress, everything was by the book. George led with calm precision, guiding them through tight crawls and narrow turns with practiced ease. But the deeper they went, the more the cave changed. Moisture coated the walls, making handholds unreliable. The floor turned slick and unpredictable. George took note, but his confidence held. This wasn't their first time underground. Eventually, they reached a narrow passage, the kind that forced them to crawl shoulder to rock. Beyond it, the air felt heavier. The dripping grew louder. It was clear the rain above was now affecting conditions below. Flooding is a known threat in real cave disaster stories like this. The team paused. Going forward meant risking flooded passages. After a quick discussion, they made the right call: turn back. To exit, they had to cross the upper smithy, an unstable zone with sheer drops and loose rock. One wrong move could be fatal. Melissa crossed first, moving carefully across the slick surface. Then Mark. Both reached the other side and turned to watch George follow. George began the crossing, slow and steady. Then something shifted. A foothold gave way, and suddenly he was falling. George moved with caution, testing each step. The rock beneath him felt thin, unstable. He felt a shift, then suddenly the ground gave way. In an instant, he dropped 30 feet into darkness. He landed hard on jagged stone. The impact crushed him. His jaw shattered, ribs cracked, right leg twisted. Blood streamed from a deep cut across his face. Somewhere inside, something burned. His spleen was torn. He was broken, paralyzed by pain and alone. Mark saw him vanish and didn't hesitate. He scrambled down the fractured rock face. George was still breathing, but barely. His body trembled, limbs bent unnaturally, blood pooling beneath him. He reached him and took one look. It was bad. A real underground survival scenario was unfolding below the surface.
George's breaths came in shallow gasps, his voice barely a whisper. Mark turned to Melissa and said what needed saying: "We need help." He made the hardest call of his life, leaving his friend behind. Climbing out of Ogof Ffynnon is slow even on a good day, but now every second counted. George's condition was fading fast, his mind slipping in and out. Melissa stayed behind, kneeling beside him. She whispered to keep him awake, to keep him anchored. The cave around them stood still, silent, as George clung to life in the darkness. Above ground, Mark burst from the cave, gasping for air, legs shaking. He raced to the car and drove straight to the South Wales Caving Club, where trained rescuers were on standby. That's when one of the UK's most dramatic real cave rescues began. Within the hour, a cave rescue team was deployed, armed with medical kits, climbing gear, and stretchers. They descended into the cave fast. The path was slick, narrow, and unforgiving. Time was against them. If George was going to survive, they had to reach him quickly. Below, Melissa stayed at George's side. His skin had gone pale, his lips quivering. Pain racked his body, and his breathing grew shallow. He held on, tethered only to Melissa's voice and the faint light of her headlamp. They were deep underground, and hope was fading. 2 hours after Mark raised the alarm, the rescue team's voices echoed through the tunnel, hope breaking through the dark.
When they reached George, he was barely responsive. His breathing was uneven, his body ice cold. The rescuers moved quickly, assessing him on the spot. Every injury had to be stabilized. His limbs were braced, wounds dressed. Then came the hard part, extraction. The stretcher was carefully fitted around him, but the space was tight. Moving him meant crawling inches at a time. Rescuers squeezed through the rock ahead of him, guiding the stretcher over jagged ledges. Every shift risked further injury. It was slow, brutal, and delicate. One wrong move could cost him everything. The Ogof ffynnon cave rescue effort would become a benchmark in British rescue history. Outside, more rescuers and medics stood ready. Time dragged. The rescue team rotated in shifts, ensuring no one lost focus. The deeper sections demanded precise rope work. Every foothold had to be secure. Inch by inch, they carried George through the maze. It took over 24 hours. At last, as dawn broke, George emerged into the cold morning air. His body was broken, face swollen and streaked with dried blood, but he was alive. He was rushed to the hospital. Multiple surgeries followed. His jaw was rebuilt. His ribs slowly mended. His leg, though severely damaged, was saved. The road to recovery was long, but George pulled through.
On December 27, 2003, 8 boys from the San Antonio Boys Village in Florida set out for Boy Scout Cave, led by 2 counselors. Among them were 15-year-old Michael Sherrow and 16-year-old Javik Henderson, eager for adventure and ready to take on the Florida cave's tight, twisting passages. The counselors, citing their size, chose to stay at the surface. The boys went in alone. Boy Scout Cave in Florida was known for its narrow crawls and sharp turns, but it had a reputation for being dry and structurally stable. With only 9 flashlights between them, the group entered the cave shortly after noon. As they descended, the temperature dropped to a constant 72 degrees Fahrenheit, and daylight quickly vanished behind them. One counselor lit a small campfire near the entrance to stay warm. What he didn't realize was that this harmless fire would become a critical factor in the Boy Scout Cave rescue ahead. Michael and Javik led the way through the tight maze. The deeper they crawled, the more the cave seemed to press in around them. The air was still and the silence unnerving. About an hour in, they reached a sharp, narrow bend called the hairpin curve, a known choke point in the cave. The group paused at the narrow bend. Without their counselors, uncertainty crept in. Michael, trying to stay confident, took the lead and entered the hairpin curve. This passage was the tightest they had faced, a narrow horizontal slit with a sharp 180-degree turn. Jagged limestone walls pressed in from all sides. The ceiling was low, the floor uneven, forcing anyone through to twist and crawl in awkward angles. Michael squeezed ahead, disappearing around the bend. Henderson followed, inching his body through the tight space. As he reached the curve, he twisted to follow the angle, but then stopped. He couldn't move. Wedged in the bend, he was stuck. Panic set in. He tried to shift his body, but nothing budged. His breathing grew faster, echoing off the phone. Michael, hearing the distress, turned to help. The rest of the boys waited in tense silence, their voices echoing faintly through the cave. Michael crawled back toward the curve, forcing himself into the narrow space beside Henderson. The jagged limestone scraped their skin as they struggled in the tight, airless crawl. Michael pulled and pushed, trying to shift Henderson's body, but the rock pressed in from all sides. Henderson was locked in place, twisted unnaturally. Sharp stone dug into his ribs and hips, shooting pain through his body with every movement. It felt like the cave was crushing him.
Minutes dragged into an hour. Exhausted, Michael kept trying, but the cold stone drained their body heat fast. With no room to move and constant contact with the damp limestone, their strength began to fade. Then Michael's vision blurred. His arms weakened. He could no longer fight the cave. Without warning, Michael collapsed, his body going limp against the narrow rock walls. Henderson, still trapped, felt panic surge. His friend was unconscious, and he couldn't move. All he could do was scream for help, his voice echoing down the passage. The rest of the group, still in the wider section, heard the shouts. Flashlights flickered as batteries wore thin. Panic took hold. They realized how serious the situation had become. 2 boys were now in real danger, and they couldn't reach them. Fear spread fast. Some began to worry the campfire outside was burning up the oxygen, making it harder to breathe. Their confidence vanished. The Florida cave suddenly felt smaller, colder, deadlier. Reluctantly, they made a choice. They couldn't save Michael and Henderson alone. Crawling back through the cave, they left their friends behind and raced for the surface to call for help. Outside, the counselors had no idea what had happened. When the boys emerged, breathless and wide-eyed, their panic said it all. The counselors quickly put out the fire and called 911. One stayed behind to comfort the shaken group, though their words offered little reassurance. Within the hour, rescue teams arrived. These were seasoned cavers, familiar with the cave's narrow crawls, but even they knew this would be difficult. Boy Scout Cave's tight passages were hard enough to navigate without hauling rescue gear, and with concerns about oxygen depletion, the pressure was intense. Inside, rescuers found the boys huddled together, pale, crying, and convinced the air was running out. The fear of suffocation hung thick in the cave, but after testing the air, experts confirmed there was no oxygen shortage. The panic had fed itself. What the boys feared wasn't real. It was psychological, not physical. That news brought a wave of relief, but the mission wasn't over. 2 boys were still trapped deeper in the cave. Michael and Henderson were still trapped. The Florida Cave Rescue Team wasted no time. Armed with harnesses and chisels, they followed the route the boys had described. The passages were too narrow for bulky gear, so rescuers relied on minimal tools and sheer effort.
At the hairpin curve, the situation was dire. Henderson was conscious but shivering, his skin pale and damp. Michael lay motionless just ahead, barely breathing. Both were slipping into hypothermia. The rock had drained their body heat, and now time was their biggest enemy. Rescuers quickly assessed the scene and began freeing Henderson. The space was suffocatingly tight. Using small chisels, they chipped away at the limestone, each strike echoing through the cave. The rescuers had to twist and crawl, mimicking the same tight squeezes that had trapped the boys. It took over an hour to free Henderson. When he finally slid out of the hairpin curve, he sobbed in relief, his body stiff, trembling from cold and exhaustion. Rescuers wrapped him in a thermal blanket and began the long, slow journey to the surface. Then came Michael. He was still unconscious, his condition critical. The team worked faster, chiseling through solid rock to widen the passage. Each second dragged as they fought against the cave's grip. After nearly 2 hours, they pulled Michael free. His skin was ice cold, pulse barely there. They secured him in a harness and began the agonizing climb out. Every crawl and twist was a battle. The rescuers pushed through, inch by inch, knowing they were racing the clock. When the boys finally emerged, medics were already in place. Emergency crews rushed in, wrapping Michael and Henderson in thermal blankets, starting treatment on the spot. Both were rushed to the hospital, suffering from severe hypothermia after cave rescue. Henderson was alert. Michael remained unconscious for nearly 24 hours. In the aftermath, it was clear what went wrong. The counselors' choice to stay outside, while not malicious, left the group without leadership inside the cave. And with too little equipment and not enough preparation, what should have been a simple exploration turned into a near-fatal Florida cave incident.
May 30th, 1999 began like any other for Frank Reyes, a veteran caving guide and instructor with the National Cave Rescue Commission. Leading groups through Puerto Rico's Cueva Los Angeles was second nature to him. He knew every twist, chamber, and danger hidden in its depths. But that day, the cave would demand the ultimate price from the man devoted to its exploration and safety. The group he led numbered 17, adventure seekers and curious first-timers. Among them was Elba Vasquez Gonzalez, a middle-aged woman determined to face her fears. Reyes, with his usual warmth, reassured her and others who hesitated, lightheartedly calling the cave their underground playground. Just after midday, they stepped from sunlight into the cave's permanent darkness. Reyes led with practiced ease. Ahead stretched a stream passage, harmless at first glance, but the only route deeper inside. For most, it was unlike anything they had experienced, wading through cool, shallow water, crossing slick rocks, and taking in the strange beauty around them. Reyes moved easily through the group, offering a steady hand to anyone who stumbled. The walls echoed with the sound of moving water, and the dim light from their lamps carved shapes out of the darkness. Every step brought them farther from the surface and deeper into the cave's cold silence. Far away, unseen rain in the mountains had sent a surge of water racing through the underground network towards them. He glanced back at the group, instincts sharpening. The current tugged at their feet, subtle but real. He aimed his headlamp down the passage, gauging the force he couldn't yet see. They were safe for the moment, but he knew they had to stay ahead of what was coming. Without sparking panic, he urged them forward, steering toward higher ground. His voice stayed calm, but carried a quiet urgency over the sound of the stream.
Then, the first sign of real danger. The water started to rise. Inch by inch, it climbed past their ankles. What moments ago was a playful trickle was now a force that could sweep them away. In the dark, confined passage, the current's sudden strength felt alive, and it was coming for them fast. Panic set in as the group fought to keep their footing. Reyes reacted instantly, shouting for them to move to higher ground. He pointed toward a steep, rocky slope leading to an upper passage. They scrambled upward as the water surged faster, the roar of the flood growing so loud it drowned every other sound. Rocks and debris hurtled past in the torrent, adding to the danger. As they neared the incline, the noise of rushing water intensified, echoing through the cave. The passage tightened, the walls pressing in, and the current clawed at their legs with relentless force. Vasquez faltered on the slick, uneven ground, her balance wavering. Her breaths came quick and shallow, fear tightening its grip as the water rose around her. Then it happened. Her foot found a hidden rock beneath the surface, and she slipped. The current seized her instantly, yanking her downstream with brutal power. The group froze, horror etched on their faces as her body twisted violently in the torrent. Her scream lasted only a second before the flood swallowed it. The water slammed her against jagged walls, the crack of her head striking stone echoing above the roar. Her body went limp, spinning helplessly in the raging current. In that moment, the fight for survival turned into a desperate race against the cave itself. For a heartbeat, time froze. The cave filled only with the thunder of rushing water and the fading echo of her impact. Then Reyes moved. No hesitation, no second thought, just action. He dove headfirst into the raging current. The torrent slammed into him, clawing at his limbs, threatening to pull him under, but he drove forward, every muscle straining against the surge. The group watched in shock as he vanished into the chaos. Reyes powered through the flood, each stroke fueled by urgency, ignoring the burn in his lungs and the ache in his arms. He reached Vasquez just as the current tried to drag her beneath. Her face was pale, slack, a thin line of blood curling from the wound on her forehead. He hooked an arm around her, the other bracing against jagged rock to fight the pull of the water. She was barely conscious, her body limp, heavy and ice cold. The flood had stripped her of strength, leaving her helpless in its grip. Reyes pulled her close, shielding her as debris whipped past, sharp fragments that could slice flesh in an instant. His breaths came in hard bursts, every movement a struggle against the cave's relentless force. With the last reserves of his strength, he began to lift Vasquez inch by inch. Hands reached down from above, faces tight with desperation as they strained to pull her up. Reyes shoved with everything he had, his world narrowed to one goal, getting her out. With a final surge, Vasquez was in their grasp, her limp body dragged onto the dry ledge. Relief rippled through the group. It lasted seconds. As Reyes prepared to climb, a massive wave exploded into the passage, larger and faster than any before. It struck like a wrecking ball, the impact rattling his bones and ripping his hands from the rock. His feet slipped, balance gone, and in a single violent pull, the current tore him away, swallowing him into the raging black.
Above, Vasquez's eyes snapped open, bloodied, disoriented. She screamed as she saw Reyes swept away, her voice raw and jagged, echoing off the cavern walls. She lunged to the edge, arm outstretched, fingers trembling to grasp him. For a heartbeat, their hands touched, skin against skin in the chaos, before the torrent ripped him from reach. Her scream shattered the roar of the water, laced with pure anguish. The group froze, helpless, as Reyes vanished into the black. His headlamp flared once, a dim beacon in the raging current, then blinked out, swallowed by the flood. Silence followed, broken only by the endless surge of water. The remaining guides took over, forcing the group toward higher ground. The climb was punishing, slick rock under their hands, icy air biting their lungs. They moved in grim silence, the weight of what they'd lost pressing on every step.
In a dry chamber above, they collapsed together, breathless and hollow-eyed. The air hung heavy with the absence of their leader. Vasquez, though alive, sat apart, shaking with sobs that racked her battered frame. One guide, a longtime friend of Reyes, settled beside her, a silent presence in the darkness, both knowing no comfort could fill the void left behind. Outside, alarms had already been raised. By dawn, rescue teams reached the cave, battling high floodwaters and unstable passages. Hours of tense navigation brought them to the trapped group. Vasquez, weak but resolute, insisted on walking out with help, her thoughts fixed on Reyes's final moments. They emerged into daylight, faces marked by exhaustion and grief. Vasquez was rushed to the hospital. Her injuries were treatable, but the emotional wounds cut far deeper. Later that day, divers recovered Reyes's body downstream from where the current had claimed him. News of his death spread fast. The caving community responded with an outpouring of tributes. As Vasquez recovered, guilt gnawed at her, convinced the tragedy was her fault. Reyes's friends visited often, easing her burden with stories, his quick wit, steady hand, and instinct to protect others. He lived for this, they told her. He'd have done the same for anyone. That's who he was, a man who put others first no matter the cost. To those who knew him, Reyes was never just a guide. He was a mentor, a shield against danger, and a friend. His final act in Cueva Los Angeles became a defining testament to his courage and devotion. Jackson Blue Spring, Florida, was a vast cave system with crystal-clear water. Harry Miller, 48, was a veteran open-water diver with over 20 years of experience. His partner, Gordon Smith, 58, had only basic cave diving certification and little practice beyond controlled dives. Still, on March 5, 2007, both chose to explore a side passage off the main route, going deeper than their training recommended. They decided quickly, relying on confidence built from years in open water. But cave diving was different. Here, training and preparation decided survival. Their plan was simple: enter the spring, follow the main passage, then explore a lesser-known side tunnel. Gordon was cautious but trusted Harry's lead. They checked their gear, tested regulators, and exchanged a final okay before descending into the blue depths. The entry was mesmerizing. Sunlight poured through the opening, casting an eerie glow on the limestone walls. Tiny fish scattered as they glided past. At 60 feet, the cave mouth opened wide, revealing a massive chamber carved by time. Adjusting their buoyancy, they moved forward, their dive lights slicing through the silent darkness like twin blades. After 600 feet of clear passage, they reached the narrow side tunnel. The walls here pressed closer, shadows swallowing the light. Gordon hesitated. The opening was tighter than expected. He flashed his light at Harry, silently asking, "Are you sure?" Harry nodded, already angling through the restriction. Gordon followed carefully, keeping his kicks gentle to avoid stirring silt. The tunnel twisted sharply, demanding precise movements. Each foot forward made the limestone walls feel tighter. Then disaster struck. As Harry maneuvered ahead, his tank scraped the rock and jammed. The harness locked in place. He tried shifting, but the passage clamped down around him. A burst of silt filled the water, blinding them instantly. Harry paused, forcing calm. His tank was wedged deep in the limestone. Instinct told him to back out, but each movement made the rock bite harder. He exhaled to shrink his profile, but the restriction remained merciless. He froze, steadying his breath, and began to think. The silt he'd kicked up hung in the water like a suffocating fog, swallowing every trace of light.
Within seconds, visibility dropped to 0. He couldn't even see his own hands, just the dull glow of his dive light fading into a brown haze. Moving blindly would only make things worse. The plan had been simple, a quick peek inside, nothing more. He hadn't even bothered laying a guideline, confident he could turn back easily. Now, trapped in the swirling void, he couldn't tell where forward ended and backward began. Panic scratched at the edges of his mind, but he forced it down. Focus. Somewhere behind him, Gordon was out there, probably still unaware of how bad things had turned. If Harry could just shift his tank, if he could get free, they could still make it out. He twisted his shoulders, trying to angle backward, inch by inch. Suddenly, his foot slipped against the slick limestone, sending up another thick cloud of silt. The darkness deepened. He stopped moving, forcing himself to listen, to think. Only the steady hiss of his regulator broke the silence. The cave felt timeless, unmoving. He still had air, he still had options, but only if he stayed calm. Gordon froze as the swirling silt turned the crystal-clear water into a black curtain. He instinctively kicked backward, giving the cloud space to settle, hoping visibility would return in seconds. But when the haze began to thin, his heart sunk. Harry was still there, wedged tightly, his tank jammed against the unyielding rock. His fins twitched helplessly, each movement sending up more debris. Gordon swam closer, locking eyes with Harry through the mask. He gave the universal hand signal, "Stay calm." But Harry's response told a different story. His chest rose and fell faster, each breath raspier than the last, bubbles exploding from his regulator in chaotic bursts. Panic was setting in, and Gordon knew how dangerous that could be. There wasn't time to argue underwater. Gordon with the only choice he could. He turned sharply and kicked hard, forcing himself through the twisting passage towards the entrance. The once short swim now felt endless. Every second was heavy, every stroke echoing the thought pounding in his head, "Get help, now." Breaking the surface, he tore out his regulator and gasped for air before shouting for assistance. His emergency call went out immediately. Backup was on the way.
Below, Harry heard Gordon's movements fade until there was nothing but silence. The water around him grew eerily still. The silt cloud had thickened again, wrapping him in an oppressive darkness. He couldn't see his hands, couldn't find the walls, couldn't even tell which way led out. All he had was the crushing pressure of stone against his chest and shoulders, and the hollow sound of his own ragged breathing. His air supply was steady, but time was against him. Alone and terrified, panic took over. Instead of waiting for help, Harry decided to save himself. His only chance was to free his body. He reached down, fumbling at his harness, the one thing keeping him pinned. His fingers, stiff and numb from exhaustion, struggled to find the buckle. He yanked once. Nothing. Twice. Still stuck. On the third desperate pull, it finally loosened. Harry exhaled hard, forcing every bit of air from his lungs to shrink his chest. Twisting his body with everything he had, he finally created just enough space to move. Encouraged, he ditched the harness completely. The tank slipped away into the darkness. The crushing weight lifted, and for the first time he could move freely. But now he was exposed. No tank, no gear, no guideline, just himself and nearly 600 feet of flooded passage between him and survival. Still, he pushed forward, stretching his arms blindly into the void, feeling for any opening that promised escape. Every kick, every stroke burned precious oxygen. His lungs screamed, instinct warning him that every second counted. In the suffocating blackness, he forced himself onward, hoping, praying, guessing he was headed the right way. He had to be close. He had to find the way out. Meanwhile, outside, 12 minutes later, Gordon made the call for help. Renowned cave diver Ed Sorensen arrived on the scene and wasted no time. Strapping on his gear and mounting a motorized scooter, he plunged beneath the surface, descending at full speed. Within minutes, he was deep inside the cave system. At first, the water ahead was crystal clear, but as he approached the side passage, the world dissolved into chaos. A dense cloud of silt hung in the water like a living wall, swallowing everything beyond. Visibility dropped to almost nothing.
Ed slowed down, switching from speed to precision. His expert hands glided along the sharp limestone edges, feeling his way forward in total darkness. Every second mattered. He knew from experience that time and air were enemies here. The longer Harry stayed trapped, the narrower his chances of survival became. Then, about 4 minutes into his search, Ed finally found him. Harry was no longer trapped. His body floated free, but his gear, his lifeline, had been abandoned. His tank still had air, the regulator still worked, but in his panic, Harry had made one fatal mistake. He'd removed his equipment, thinking it was the only way to squeeze through the passage and escape. Disoriented, with no line and no air, he tried to swim blindly towards safety, but in the endless darkness of the cave, he never made it. Ed knew instantly what had gone wrong. The clues were all there: panic, disorientation, and a desperate attempt to survive that led to one catastrophic mistake. The cave hadn't claimed Harry's life, panic had. Without his tank, there was no oxygen. Without a safety line, there was no direction. Trapped in a blizzard of silt, surrounded by darkness, Harry lost all sense of up or down, and eventually he lost his fight for life. Elatchua Sink lies in Elatchua County, Florida, part of a vast freshwater cave network. Even in good conditions, it's considered an advanced dive when demanding skill, training, and strict planning. The sink leads into a maze of tunnels, chambers, and false routes. It's no place for casual divers or anyone willing to gamble with safety. But July in Florida brings problems that make dives like this nearly impossible. Heat fuels massive algae blooms in freshwater systems, turning water into thick, green haze. Visibility drops to inches, and in caves, that's a death sentence. Every trained cave diver knows the rule. When algae blooms strike, you call off the dive. No debate. In July 1992, 2 divers reached Elatchua Sink and ignored that rule. The water looked like liquid paint, so choked with algae that lights could barely cut a foot ahead. They had driven hours, set up gear, and built excitement for the cave. Instead of turning back, they chose to press forward into the system, pushing straight into danger. The divers slipped into Elatchua Sink and began their descent through the algae-choked water. Their lights cut only inches ahead, swallowed by the thick green haze, which should have been a simple entry into the main tunnel, quickly turned into confusion. They could barely see, feeling blindly along the limestone walls in search of the guideline. In cave diving, that line is everything. It's the path in and out, the only way to survive the maze of submerged passages. Under normal conditions, losing sight of it can mean death. In near-zero visibility, staying on it is the difference between living and vanishing. Not far into the dive, unease set in. The tunnel felt wrong. The walls seemed narrower, the slope unfamiliar, the direction off. They weren't in the main passage at all. In the green void, they had drifted into a side tunnel. Realizing their error, panic pressed at the edges of their thoughts. But instinct told them to turn back. They attempted to retrace their path, hoping to reconnect with the entrance and regain control before the cave swallowed them completely. It should have been simple. Turn around, retrace your path, and abort the dive. But in zero visibility, even the most basic procedures can unravel into life-threatening complications. The buddy trailed just behind his partner, straining to stay close in the algae-choked water. The thick blooms swallowed their lights, reducing visibility to just a few inches. Every so often, he'd catch a faint shimmer of his partner's glow ahead, there 1 second, gone the next, like a ghost fading in and out of the murk. For a while, it seemed like everything was under control. His partner appeared to be following the main line back towards safety, and the buddy kept right on his tail. But caves are merciless places, and in their silence, the smallest mistake can become a death sentence. Somewhere in the confusion, a critical error unfolded. In the oppressive green darkness, with both men consumed by the struggle to find their way out, they lost each other. Maybe his partner strayed into a false passage. Maybe he moved too far ahead. Maybe the buddy drifted slightly off course without realizing it. Whatever the cause, one thing became terrifyingly clear. A moment ago, there had been a guiding light. Now, there was nothing. Following standard cave diving procedure, the buddy continued his exit. Believing his partner was somewhere ahead of him on the guideline, he began reeling in the line as he swam. Standard practice to tidy up after a dive. The thin cord coiled neatly onto his reel as he pushed through the dark, murky passages toward daylight. When he finally broke the surface at Elatchua Sink, he ripped off his mask and gulped in the humid Florida air. The opening was small enough that anyone surfacing would be impossible to miss, but the water was still. His partner wasn't there. A chill of dread ran through him. The missing diver should have reached the exit first. He'd last seen his light ahead on the line, heading out. Yet the surface was empty, silent except for the faint lap of water and the distant buzz of insects under the blazing heat. The buddy called out, hoping his partner had surfaced somewhere nearby or taken a different route out. No answer. The silence confirmed what he already feared. Somewhere beneath him, his partner was still trapped inside the cave. Realizing something was terribly wrong, the buddy launched into frantic line searches. The algae bloom that had made the dive risky from the start now turned the search into a nightmare. His lights vanished into the murk after just a few inches. He could feel the guideline beneath his fingers and trace the rough walls of the passage, but actually locating another diver in that sprawling labyrinth was nearly impossible, like trying to find a needle in a haystack while blindfolded and underwater. After several desperate but fruitless searches, the sickening truth sank in. He couldn't do it alone. Gasping at the surface, he reached for the phone no diver ever wants to dial. His voice was tight as he reported what every cave diver dreads: a partner missing underground. Rescue divers mobilized within minutes, knowing how quickly hope fades in these situations. In cave diving accidents, the first hours are everything. If the missing diver had managed to wedge himself into an air pocket, he might still be breathing, but every passing minute slashed the odds of survival. The team that arrived weren't just ordinary divers. They were elite cave specialists who knew the twists of Elatchua sink like few others alive. But even these seasoned divers were stunned by what they encountered. They later described it as the worst visibility they had ever faced at Elatchua sink. The algae bloom was so thick that even their most powerful lights couldn't cut through it. The beams faded into a green fog within inches, leaving them to grope blindly through the passages. The search became painfully slow, an inch-by-inch process of feeling along walls, tracing guidelines, and probing every side tunnel and chamber they could reach. Few outside the diving community realized just how complex Elatchua's system was: multi-level passages, hidden offshoots, and narrow twists that could disorient even the most experienced diver. In desperation, the team even attempted to pump fresh water into the system, hoping to dilute the murk and restore some visibility. But it was useless. The algae was too widespread, too dense, swallowing the clean water without effect. For 3 long, agonizing days, the search dragged on. Divers rotated in shifts, refusing to give up. At the surface, family members kept vigil, clinging to faint hope. The wider diving community held its breath, knowing how easily any of them could one day be in the same situation. On the 3rd day, the grim discovery came. Hidden in a passage almost impossible to see in the pea soup water, they finally found the missing diver. It appeared he had strayed from the main guideline, perhaps mistaking some other line or formatation for it, and had wandered deeper into the maze instead of towards safety.
December 3rd, 2011. 4 skilled cavers stood at the entrance of a remote Illinois cave, ready for their toughest expedition yet. Chad McCain, Todd McCartney, Ralph Sawyer, and Jason Kern planned to spend 10 to 16 hours underground, pushing through water-filled passages with airspace as low as 6 to 10 inches. McCain was new to this cave system. McCartney, 44, was the veteran who had explored it many times. Sawyer and Kern completed the experienced team. Their goal was a notorious water-filled section that had challenged explorers for years, forcing cavers to crawl through icy water with faces scraping rocky ceilings. McCartney came prepared with extra cold water protection, wearing a neoprene hoodie over his wetsuit. The others carried standard gear, knowing the freezing temperatures would test them constantly. The water would be brutal, and the low airspace meant panic could turn deadly fast. The 4 entered the cave and pushed toward the flooded passage. When they arrived, the sight was intimidating. The narrow tunnel stretched ahead, filled with black, icy water reflecting their headlamps. The ceiling dropped until barely enough space remained to breathe.
Despite being new here, McCain volunteered to lead upstream. As he slid into the freezing water, the cold hit him like a physical blow. The depth was 3 to 4 feet, but the low ceiling forced him to crawl awkwardly, helmet in hand, pressing his face tightly against the rock above. The airspace had already shrunk to just 6 inches, and then it narrowed even further until McCain reached a section where the ceiling came within barely 3 inches of the water's surface. This was beyond dangerous, territory where a single mistake could be fatal. McCain froze, weighing his options carefully. Going forward meant gambling with his life. From behind, McCartney watched McCain hesitate. That brief pause pushed McCartney into making a fateful choice. Confident in his thicker cold water protection, he decided to push deeper, believing he could handle what lay ahead. To reduce drag, he left his pack with the group, held his helmet in front of him for protection, and slid past McCain into the lead.
The water was bitterly cold, but his neoprene gear kept him insulated just enough to continue. With his nose pressed against the slick cave ceiling, McCartney pulled himself forward, gasping shallow breaths through an airspace no thicker than the width of 2 fingers. Every inch forward was a battle. The walls closed in, the ceiling scraped his helmet, and the oppressive weight of rock above made every movement suffocatingly claustrophobic. He crept another 40 feet beyond McCain's furthest point, into territory no human had ever set foot or even breathed before. The passage wound and twisted, the ceiling never more than 3 or 4 inches above the water. By now, turning back would be slow and nearly impossible. He was committed, trapped between courage and catastrophe. Then, disaster struck. As McCartney rounded a tight bend, his worst nightmare materialized. The passage didn't continue straight. It angled sharply downward. The tiny pocket of air he'd been clinging to vanished. The ceiling dropped even lower, the water level remained constant, and ahead there was virtually no airspace left. McCartney suddenly found himself staring at a narrow, water-filled tube with no space for his head above the surface. He tried to back out, but the tight squeeze made reversing nearly impossible. A rush of panic hit him as the reality sank in. He was trapped in a flooded section with no air pocket in sight. His lungs screamed for oxygen as he held his breath, desperately trying to decide whether to push forward or retreat, but the bend ahead had turned into a deadly trap. Icy water surged over his face as he struggled against the jagged rock walls, his movements growing more frantic with every passing second. Oxygen deprivation began to set in, clouding his thoughts and slowing his reactions. And then, everything spiraled out of control. Around the bend, the rest of the team first heard splashes echoing through the passage. At first, they assumed McCartney had found a tricky section and was working his way through it. But the splashes didn't stop. They grew louder, more chaotic. Soon, the muffled sounds of thrashing replaced the steady rhythm of a skilled caver's movements. Something was terribly wrong. McCartney's light glimmered faintly from around the curve, but it danced erratically, betraying his struggle. McCain called out to him, his voice bouncing off the damp cave walls, but there was no answer, only the frantic splashes of someone fighting for their life. And then, abruptly, there was silence. Heart pounding, McCain pushed upstream as fast as the narrow passage would allow, his breath quick and shallow. Finally, he rounded the bend, and his worst fears were confirmed. McCartney's movements were wild and uncoordinated, his strength fading with every second. McCain could only watch in helpless horror as his friend slipped beneath the surface. Seconds later, McCartney resurfaced, but this time he floated face down, limp and motionless against the cold stone wall. McCain and Sawyer surged forward, but the tunnel's unforgiving narrowness turned every second into a battle. The confined passage left barely enough room to move, and reaching McCartney felt like clawing through a stone coffin. The airspace was dangerously low, the water icy and relentless, and panic clawed at the edges of their minds. Then, Sawyer cracked. Overwhelmed by the suffocating rock walls and the chaos unfolding around him, he lost control for a moment. Thrashing, he slipped under the freezing water. His muffled struggles echoed through the cramped passage until he managed to surface in a tiny air bell, gasping for breath. But the damage was done. His helmet and light were gone, swallowed by the darkness. Blood trickled down his face where the jagged rock had sliced his skin. Now there were 2 men in trouble, and dwindling light in a deadly, water-filled choke point. McCain knew they were running out of time. McCartney had already been submerged far too long. Every second without oxygen was another step closer to irreversible brain damage. Pushing through the current and clawing for every inch, McCain finally reached McCartney after what felt like hours but had been just 45 agonizing seconds. The sight sent a chill down his spine. McCartney was limp, unresponsive, his body drifting in the frigid water like a lifeless doll. McCain hooked an arm under his friend and began dragging him downstream, fighting both the current and the rock pressing against his chest. The nearest dry area, the only place where they could even attempt real CPR, was still more than 600 feet away. Somehow, McCain found a section with just 10 inches of water and barely a foot of precious airspace. It wasn't much, but it had to be enough. They rolled McCartney onto his back, and the reality hit them like a hammer. His eyes were glassy, his face caked in mud, and there were no signs of life. In that cramped, unforgiving void, McCain started CPR, forcing breath into lungs that refused to respond and compressing a chest that felt more lifeless with every second. Each attempt was a desperate fight against the rising tide of panic.
Sawyer and Kern threw themselves into the effort, working frantically to keep McCartney's head above the icy water while forcing rescue breaths between compressions. Every second dragged like an eternity. In the pitch-black confines of the cave, with freezing water swirling around them and no hope of outside assistance, their friend's life was entirely in their hands. McCain kept pumping McCartney's chest with relentless determination, his muscles screaming from exhaustion but refusing to give in. The others steadied McCartney's limped body, whispering desperate encouragements into the darkness. Then, after 2 or 3 agonizing minutes that felt like hours, McCartney suddenly gasped. A wet, choking inhale cut through the silence. He was alive. Relief washed over them, but there was no time to celebrate. They were still deep underground, and danger surrounded them. They carefully moved McCartney another 30 feet, 9 meters downstream, finally finding a small mud bank where he could sit upright and recover his strength. But as they regrouped, a grim reality set in. Getting out of the cave would be a nightmare. Their lighting situation was dire. Sawyer and McCartney had both lost their helmets and primary lights during the chaos. McCartney only had 1 spare mag light. Sawyer salvaged a couple of small mag lights, and Kern was left with a single backup headlamp. McCain, better prepared than the rest, handed over his extra Apex and Phoenix lights, spreading what little illumination they had among the team. But even with the extra lights, they were still operating in near darkness, relying on minimal illumination for what would be a long and grueling journey back to the surface. Every shadow seemed deeper, every passage more treacherous. McCartney started off slow and lethargic, his body still in shock from the near drowning. He coughed up water every few steps, his breath ragged and uneven. Yet with each passing minute, his strength began to return, and so did his determination. Still, the road ahead was brutal. To escape, they had to crawl through a 300-foot passage explorers ominously called the bathtub, a narrow tunnel partially flooded, leaving only 6 inches of breathable airspace. Under normal circumstances, this crawl was challenging but doable. Now, with limited light, an injured teammate, and sheer exhaustion weighing them down, it became a full-blown test of survival.
Thinking quickly, McCain devised an improvised solution. He lashed 2 Swago packs to his waist, small waterproof buoyant bags they had carried. Together, they formed a makeshift flotation device. McCartney lay forward on the packs, resting his head and chest atop them, while McCain dragged him slowly through the icy, claustrophobic crawl. It worked, but it drained them both. Every inch forward felt like an eternity, each breath precious in the shallow air pocket above the waterline. In that moment, there was no room for fear, only focus, endurance, and trust. McCain had to drag his friend through 300 feet, 91 meters of water-filled passage, forcing himself to stay calm while navigating the suffocatingly tight crawl spaces. Every inch was a battle against exhaustion, cold, and fear. McCartney, still weak and disoriented from his near drowning, had no choice but to surrender completely to his friend's strength and determination. His survival now depended entirely on McCain. Hour after relentless hour, they clawed their way through the cave system. The once thrilling passages now felt like an endless maze of obstacles, each one amplified by their fragile state. Every jagged edge scraped against their bodies, every submerged gap tested their resolve, and every breath carried the weight of uncertainty. But just when they thought the nightmare was ending, one final challenge awaited them. The entrance, their gateway to safety, required a short but steep climb. With their energy nearly depleted, it might as well have been a mountain. Thinking fast, the team rigged a rope system, working together with precision. Some members hauled from above, while others pushed and steadied from below. Finally, after 6 harrowing hours underground and 3.5 hours after the accident, the 4 men emerged into the freezing winter air. The night sky never looked so beautiful. McCartney was rushed to the hospital, where he spent 4 days recovering. Doctors confirmed he had come perilously close to drowning. Only the swift actions of his friends had saved his life. Ironically, the frigid cave water that had nearly killed him also helped preserve his brain function during the time he was unconscious.
September 5th, 1988. The Florida sun had set when Mark Hoppy and 21-year-old Debbie Eves approached Orange Grove Sink in Suwannee County for their third and final dive of the day. At 10:11 p.m., the darkness above mirrored the pitch-black cave system below. Mark had earned his basic cave certification just 4 months earlier, while Debbie had received hers even more recently on July 3rd. These entry-level certifications were meant for simple dives under ideal conditions, assuming single tanks, clear visibility, and straightforward routes. But Orange Grove Sink was far from simple. Its maze-like passages, multiple routes, and fragile sediment made it one of the most challenging dive sites. Visibility could vanish instantly, and without advanced training, the risks were enormous. For divers with only basic cave credentials, this was territory they simply weren't prepared to handle safely. Debbie's limited experience made the dive far riskier. Despite her recent certification, she had completed only 10 cave dives. To make matters worse, she was using rental gear instead of equipment she knew well. Rental setups often mean unfamiliar controls, different buoyancy, and untested configurations, factors that add danger in challenging environments. Before entering the water, they shared their plans with their instructor and other experienced cave divers. The reaction was unanimous. Every warning was firm and urgent. Seasoned divers, some who had witnessed fatal accidents, insisted they weren't ready for Orange Grove Sink. Despite these clear cautions, Mark and Debbie chose to move forward. Ignoring expert advice in cave diving often proves fatal, and their decision would become a turning point. Debbie's primary light wasn't expected to last the entire dive, yet instead of adjusting the plan, they carried a UK 1200 backup light, intending to switch when her main light failed. Attempting a light exchange deep inside a cave is risky and requires precise coordination, something inexperienced divers like them lacked. Light exchanges should be second nature, not improved fixes for poor planning.
The pair entered Orange Grove Sink and began their descent into the cave system. At first, everything went smoothly. They followed the main guideline deeper and eventually passed the halfway point of their planned route, a significant penetration that placed them far from the safety of open water. At this depth, any emergency meant a long, challenging return with partially depleted air supplies. As expected, silting soon began. In cave diving, even slight movement, equipment contact, or shifting water flow can stir up fine sediment. Once disturbed, it lingers, clouding the water and making navigation extremely difficult. Sticking to their plan, Mark and Debbie turned back as visibility dropped, but the return trip would test their limits in ways their minimal training hadn't prepared them to face. They retraced their path, hoping to locate the correct guideline, but the disturbed silt had now reduced visibility to near zero. Even experienced cave divers struggle in these conditions, where every surface looks identical and orientation becomes nearly impossible. Somewhere in the chaos, Mark managed to locate another line, but this one ended abruptly. It wasn't connected to the main exit path, leaving them disoriented once again. Time was slipping away. They knew their air wouldn't last forever, and each wrong decision pushed them further from safety. Desperate, they began a slow, methodical search pattern, sweeping their hands across the cave walls and floor in hopes of finding the original line. This is a standard cave diving recovery technique, but it requires calm, coordination, and patience, luxuries they no longer had. The backup light cast limited illumination, making it even harder to distinguish features in the suspended silk cloud. Their slates show evidence that they were still communicating during this phase, likely exchanging notes about remaining air, orientation, and possible options. But without a reliable point of reference, every decision became a gamble. In a cave system this complex, a single wrong turn can be fatal, and they were running out of chances.
They turned around and began retracing their path along the wrong guideline, desperately hoping it would lead them back to their original route and eventually to safety. But every movement they made stirred up even more sediment, and the water around them grew increasingly clouded. Visibility, already poor, was slipping away fast. Then, in the midst of the murky darkness, Debbie spotted another guideline. Believing this might be their true exit path, she made a split-second decision that would prove critical. She abandoned the line they were on and swam toward the new one. It was a fatal breach of cave diving's most fundamental safety rule. Never leave a known guideline unless you are absolutely certain of where the new one leads. As Debbie swam toward the new line, the silting reached a catastrophic point. Visibility plummeted to almost zero, turning the cave into a pitch-black void. Even with lights, the world around them dissolved into a suffocating haze. In such conditions, divers can become hopelessly disoriented, and even partners just a few feet apart can lose sight of each other in an instant. Mark struggled to keep track of Debbie, but the silt clouded everything, turning the once clear passage into a dense, murky void. Visibility had dropped to almost nothing, and even with his light, he couldn't see more than a few inches in front of his mask. Relying on training, Mark initiated a line search, a systematic cave diving procedure used to locate a missing diver. With one hand anchored to the guideline, he swept the surrounding area, reaching out, hoping to make contact. But in the swirling darkness, his efforts were in vain. Debbie was gone. Time was running out. His air supply was steadily depleting, and with the cave's conditions rapidly worsening, Mark faced a brutal decision. Continue searching blindly and risk both their lives, or begin his own exit before it was too late. Reluctantly, Mark followed the incorrect guideline back until he finally managed to relocate their original line, the one leading safely to the surface. Clinging to it, he navigated through the disorienting maze until he finally emerged from the Orange Grove sink, gasping for breath.
Once on the surface, Mark immediately alerted authorities. But deep below, Debbie was still somewhere in the silted-out labyrinth. Her decision to abandon the known guideline had left her without any reliable navigation reference. Trapped in zero visibility with limited air and no path to safety, she now faced a cave diver's ultimate nightmare: being lost, alone, in the cold, silent depths. The dense cloud of sediment that had plunged the cave into total darkness would eventually settle, but time was a luxury Debbie didn't have. Her air supply was limited, and every passing second pushed her closer to the inevitable. Even if visibility had returned, she faced another daunting challenge: locating the vital guideline that was her only path back to safety. Without it, the labyrinthine cave system became an unforgiving maze. Soon, a team of highly experienced rescue divers arrived at the scene, each of them well acquainted with Orange Grove Sink and its complex passageways. Equipped with advanced diving gear and years of expertise, they descended into the dark, cold depths. After gathering every detail from Mark, Debbie's diving partner, they carefully retraced the same routes she and Mark had taken, following every possible lead about where she might have gone. Hours into their painstaking search, they finally found her. Debbie's lifeless body floated deep within the cave, far from the main guideline. By then, the sediment had cleared, revealing the silent reality of what had happened. Her air had simply run out. The investigation into this tragedy revealed a series of small but critical missteps that combined into a fatal outcome. Debbie and Mark had been diving beyond their training limits, attempting Orange Grove Sink with only basic cave certification. But it was the loss of their continuous guideline during a simple light exchange that proved catastrophic. In cave diving, safety depends entirely on maintaining contact with these lifelines. A brief separation can mean the difference between survival and disaster, and for Debbie, it became the turning point from a manageable situation to a deadly one. Mark's successful escape from the cave provided investigators with crucial insight into the chain of events leading to Debbie's disappearance. His account allowed rescue personnel to piece together what had gone wrong, ultimately guiding recovery operations and helping them bring her back to the surface.